sixes now. One from Hayden and that beauty from Ponting. Whee!
Good morning, Vietnam, and Cambodia, and Myanmar, South Korea, and all the rest of the 161 countries in which our podcast is syndicated. You are listening to episode 31 of Radio Cricket. That is 31, the same number of runs that Sachin Tendulkar has now failed to reach in his last 10 test innings. But don't worry, that elusive 101st century is just around the corner. And probably always will be. Speaking to you live from the Czech Republic, I am Nishant Joshi. I am joined as always by the man who has killed more innocent men in the name of cricket than Chairman Mao killed in the name of cricket. It is James Marsh.
Yes, Nishant, yes, hello, yes, killing, but always in the name of love. It's lovely to say hello to you, as always, although, of course, it's been a week of very sad cricketing goodbyes.
Yes, James, well, we can dive straight into the big news of the week. After a glorious career, he's finally swallowed his pride and hung up his boots after a prolonged drought. No, folks, Tendulkar's still here, and Ricky Ponting has gone after 168 tests. Ponting scored just 32 runs in his last series against South Africa, his second worst ever series after he scored just 17 runs in that famous series in India in 2001 where he struggled so famously against Harbhajan Singh. So, James, what did you make of Ricky Ponting as a Pom who was occasionally tormented by punter?
Well, indeed, I was, but I mean, I still think he was the most sort of magnificent bastard that I saw play cricket in my lifetime, which is no mean feat considering he played with Matthew Hayden. Nishan, you mentioned India and Harbhajan there, and of course he was Harbhajan's 50th, 250th and 300th test victim. But, you know, alongside losing 3 Ashes series as a captain, these were minor blips in what was otherwise an absolutely astonishing career. So, Nishan, what were the highlights for you?
My most memorable Ponting moment was in the 2003 World Cup final when he really just absolutely decimated India in a sort of way which I'd never really seen on such a big stage before. India really came into the final in excellent form, and most people expected it to be a really close run match. You had 2 greats of their time, Ponting versus Tendulkar, and Ponting absolutely took the game away from India. He scored 140 not out of 121 balls, and he even outshone Damien Martyn, who scored one of the classiest 88 not outs you'll ever see in your life. And the notable thing about that innings was that Ponting scored 116 out of 140 runs on the leg side, which is something almost unheard of. And he scored 8 sixes in that, just compared to 4 fours. And it really was a man at the peak of his powers, on the biggest stage, single-handedly destroying an attack which had been quite parsimonious throughout the tournament. Of course, you had legends such as Javagal Srinath bowling to him, Ashish Nehra, Zahir Khan, and of course, as you mentioned, his nemesis Harbhajan Singh. And Ponting really took them all to the cleaners on that day, and it really was just absolutely breathtaking. It was the first time I've ever been literally awestruck watching a batsman on TV.
You know, I think Indian fans talk about that in the same sort of slightly masochistic way that English fans talk about his 156 at Old Trafford to deny them in 2005 when he faced down an Andrew Flintoff who was even more aggressive and bulgy-eyed than the Andrew Flintoff we saw in the boxing ring in Manchester this week. But for me, his greatest innings came in 2006, and it was actually the match in Adelaide when England had posted 551 batting first, and they eventually lost. They crumbled in the face of Warne's psychological mastery as he destroyed them in the second innings. But Australia were only actually back in that game because Ponting made 142. Clarke actually made a ton in that game as well. But that was really the point, when the hope that this might be another topsy-turvy Ashes series like in 2005, that England could compete after being demolished in the first test in Brisbane, it really started to drain away. So I think for me as an England fan, that's the most sort of masochistic Ponting love innings I can think of. But of course, Ponting bowed out at Perth this week, and turning our thoughts to his successor, Michael Clarke, he of course had a tremendously successful series individually against South Africa. He scored 2 double tons, but his team eventually lost 1-0 after a fairly crushing defeat at the Wacker. So, Nishan, what are your thoughts on both the series and Michael Clarke?
Well, James, as you know, the last few days saw a public apology from an Australian journalist to Michael Clarke, where he wrote an open letter in a newspaper saying how sorry he was for essentially sneering at him for the last 7 years and for labelling him with that much maligned metrosexual tag. And it's a shame that Clarke had to overcome the prejudice of being labelled in this way. And as you well know, James, I can sympathise with the man because many of our listeners have indeed often emailed and tweeted in their hurtful comments accusing me of being metrosexual. And all I can say is that just because I use a hair conditioner with coconut extract, just because I like to wear cardigans, and just because that one time I had a dream about a threesome with Liz Hurley and Shane Warne, it does not make me metrosexual. In fact, over the past few years, it does seem as if the Australian press have been quick to project their own insecurities about manliness by insulting Michael Clarke at every opportunity. They never really liked him because he wasn't their ideal of an heir to the throne for the Aussie captaincy, which is usually a preserve only for blokes like Ponting, Steve Waugh, Alan Border, real salt of the earth men. Whereas Clarke was the man for a new millennium. Instead of sharing beers with the blokes, he preferred to sip on strawberry daiquiris with his model girlfriend. Michael Clarke is quite a modern, cosmopolitan antithesis to the traditional Australian lad, with his dyed hair and deodorant being quite foreign to traditional Aussies. And it seemed that people really resented him. And 7 years after he made his Test debut, the Australian media can ask themselves a question and perhaps do a bit of introspection. How much does it cost to be accepted by the Australian media? It's only taken 7 years, and being the number one ranked Test batsman in the world and scoring 4 Test double centuries in a year for Michael Clarke to be accepted as one of his own.
Well, indeed. Well, it does seem a little bit unfair, and I think there is this machismo historical precedent. I mean, just because a man does a few photo shoots in tight lycra flower print undies, I mean, he's labelled for life. Okay, well, Nishan, perhaps if I could just gently tear you away from Michael Clarke's underwear and lead you back to events on the field. Obviously, it was a hugely impressive series win for the rather rugged and manly South Africans, but apart from that, what were the factors which you saw contributed to this great victory?
Well, I think overall, James, the thing that was really typical of the South African side is that they actually haven't performed to their full potential. I mean, you would expect players of the calibre of someone like Steyn, Amler, De Villiers to be blowing away sides and not just competing with them and treading water and trading punches with Australia as they have been doing. Even as we saw when South Africa visited England earlier on this year, they didn't run through them. It was more of a war of attrition. And even in this series against Australia, if you look at how the series unfolded session by session, South Africa actually came out quite poorly. They were dominated for large parts of the series, especially in the first 2 tests. Even in this last test at the WACA, they were bowled out for 225 on the first day as well, which was a fair few under par. Yet they came back stronger each time they were knocked down, and I think that's been characteristic of this South African side because this team is one of the strongest we've seen in the last 20 years. And it's all down to their mental resilience, and that can be traced back to their leadership group, I believe. You've got someone like Gary Kirsten, who really made India mentally tough. You've got Graham Smith, who is known for his mental toughness, much in the mould of Ponting and Waugh, as we discussed earlier. And the backroom staff is really something very interesting as well, because they've got Paddy Upton in as a performance director, sort of life coach, new age sort of thing, which is very interesting. If you read some of his articles and what he's been saying, his focus is on making the South African players a better team by making them better people. He's bringing out the best in them. And then you've got their trips to Switzerland, for example, with famous explorer Mike Horn. And so you've got a really strong team bond, which you can see throughout every single player in the team. And that seeps down to the likes of Faf du Plessis, who came in and did remarkably well in his debut Test series. Ironically, the one player who really got pilloried and beaten from pillar to post in this Test series and possibly has played his last Test is Imran Tahir, who didn't actually feature in that team building session in Switzerland. He stayed, ironically, to practice his bowling in South Africa.
It has all been rather downhill for Tahir in Australia, Nishan. But aside from Switzerland, there was also this rest and recuperation break which the South Africans had after the first Test and before the Adelaide Test, where they actually were allowed to go snorkeling, surfing, fishing. And when the Adelaide Test didn't start off so well, they actually got quite heavily criticised for that. But obviously, I think in the end, and Kirsten has been vindicated for this more rounded individual approach which he's taken. But just coming back to leadership and the way that Smith has led from the front, just looking at his stats, he actually averages 69 with the bat in the 22 away test matches which South Africa have won with him in the side, and he's scored 800s in those tests. So it does show that he really does make the vital runs which win matches away from home, and he's actually only the second visiting captain after England's Arthur Shrewsbury in 1884 and then again in 1887 to win 2 consecutive series in Australia. So you mentioned players like du Plessis, and of course it's worth remembering that he came in when South Africa were 4 for 45 in their second innings in the Adelaide Test. And you've also got other perhaps slightly unheralded players that also did a great job. I mean, perhaps unlike England, South Africa always seem to have a Peterson on hand when necessary, because if we think back to their summer series in England, we had, of course, Alvaro Peterson making 182 at Headingley, but then again in this test at Perth, Robin Peterson took 6 wickets across both innings, and that's only the 9th time in history that a spinner has taken that many wickets at the Wacker. But of course, Nishan, leading the line as ever for South Africa was Dale Steyn, with his face like a Picasso painting of a snarling lion. So Nishan, what did you make of his performance in the series?
Well, in the series, I think Steyn is actually been disappointing on the whole, and maybe even perhaps epitomised how South Africa have maintained their number 1 ranking in the past 2 series, especially because if you just go back a bit, earlier on in the summer, you had South Africa really struggling on the first day of the first test against England and really being heavily criticised for their perceived lack of preparation for that test series against England. But look how well they came back, and even if you look at how South Africa started off this series against Australia, they lost JP Duminy on the first afternoon for the entire series. So they really didn't start off well in any department in both series, but they've kind of shown some bounce back ability, and it's all been about peaking at the right times for South Africa. Dale Steyn, as I say, epitomises this. In the final test, when it really counted, when South Africa had been bowled out for 225 on the first day, he really came back with a vengeance, and he picked up 4 for 40 in what was quite a blistering spell, helping to bowl out Australia for just 163. And really, he did grab the entire match and series by the bollocks. He sent a message to Australia saying that South Africa know they're the best. They are peaking at the right time, and they really were like sharks circling the prey at that sort of time. And from then on, that boost from Steyn really provided a platform for South Africa to post a mammoth second innings score.
And now moving on to events in Kolkata, where the 3rd test between India and England starts on Wednesday this week. England this week have been pictured out and about playing chess against some Indian youngsters in a sort of goodwill gesture. So, Nishan, do you think they'll continue on from their good form in Mumbai and have all the right moves, or do you think their more recent checkered history against spin on the subcontinent will mean they'll be back to square one in a week's time?
Well, from a selection point of view, I guess England could go with the old adage of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. You've of course got Stuart Broad, who we've discussed many times has come under a lot of fire for bowling under pace and really lobbing marshmallow grenades. And you've got Stephen Finn returning to full fitness last week with 4 wickets in a practice match. From an Indian point of view, they have retained the same squad, although of course a couple of players are coming under increasing pressure. You've got Gautam Gambhir, who's pleaded with the media for more time, and he also said that there's no evidence to show that he's been playing poorly. To be fair to Gambhir, there's absolutely no evidence of him playing poorly, apart from all those videos of him getting clean bowled. So from the Indian point of view, if it is broke, pretend it's working fine, polish it up, dust it off, and then sell it at a higher price.
Well, indeed so, Nishan. Well, of course, some people have been mooting the 2 million nuclear option for the Indian top order in the recent week. And of course I am referring to Ravi Jadeja, who has recently notched another triple century, his 3rd in his young and short first-class career. So, I mean, I don't think we should diminish those feats. But Nishan, if I could just play the role of an ignorant Englishman, which is a role I've pretty much tried to perfect on the pod over recent months, but I would say that these innings for Jadeja have been played on lifeless pitches against attacks veering more towards the vasectomy side of potency. And if you actually look at his stats, he's played 58 ODIs. He's got a batting and bowling average of 28.6 and 38.4 respectively, which isn't too shoddy by any means, but which you need to switch round to put him in the pretty decent category. He's never made a ton or taken 5 wickets in an ODI, and so Nishan, isn't he just the Andy Carroll of cricket? Someone weighed down by the burden of a huge fee that even he must feel a bit embarrassed by and can't hope to live up to.
First of all, I think we should say it's an incredible feat to have scored 3 triple centuries in your entire career, let alone by the age of 23. Ravi Jadeja is the first Indian in history and just the 8th overall to have scored 3 first-class centuries. And he really still is a very young man. And of course, he does have that option of bowling left-arm spin as well. And it is quite easy to poke fun at Jadeja. Maybe because he does try and make it so easy for us to castigate him. But then you look at the other people in that category who've scored 3 triple centuries, and you've got the likes of W.G. Grace, Don Bradman, Brian Lara, Graham Hick, Bill Ponsford, Wally Hammond, and of course the greatest of them all, Michael Hussey. Of course these triple centuries have come on flat pitches, but if that's the case, why haven't any other Indian batsmen scored triple centuries or quadruple centuries or even septuple centuries, James? That would be my question to Jadeja haters, of which there seem to be many, and of which I'm not really sure whether I'm in the same category anymore. I'm not really sure whether I can class myself as a Jadeja hater or a Jadeja lover. He is the type of man who you love to hate.
Okay, well maybe so, but I mean if Jadeja performs half as well in his possible future test career as Graham Hick did on the England 1992-93 tour of India, he'll have done pretty well.
So that brings us to the end of another episode of Radio Cricket. Thank you very much for joining us once again this week. Do make sure you subscribe to us on SoundCloud and iTunes. James hugs his teddy bear of Steve Smith every time we get a new subscriber. So, until next week, I've been Nishant Joshi.
And I've been James Marsh. Goodbye!
I think it was a very poor performance, one of the worst things I have ever seen done on a cricket field. Good night.